everybody, and welcome to the Harry Potter Trading Card Game Revival Podcast. My name is Sammy.
I'm Huamin.
And I'm Reese, and today we're going to be talking about a pretty important concept in card games in general, and that concept is who's the beatdown. The idea comes from a Magic the Gathering article written in 1999, maybe before some people listening to this were born here, and it dives into a philosophical idea in a card game or turn-based games where you have a player who plays a beatdown role and a player who plays a control role. The beatdown role is the role or player who is trying to do what their deck wants to do in order to finish the game as quickly as possible. The control player is the player who, if they did that same thing and just played out their own plan, would lose because they would not get there first. So they must pivot and, instead of playing out their own plan, interrupt their opponent's plan in a way that puts them back ahead.
And just to be clear, these phrases of like beatdown and control here, we're not actually talking about the deck archetypes of like a beatdown deck or a control deck. But these deck archetypes will usually take on those roles within the game that they're named after. Or I'm not exactly sure which way the etymology goes here.
Yeah, happens in every single game. So every single game is going to have a beatdown and a control role.
Every single competitive two-player TCG will almost always have
Yes,
these.
exactly. But when we talk about the beatdown and control, it's just a title term for the player who will win first if they just keep going. So every game is going to have someone who's going to win first.
It pretty much kind of sounds like the person whose plan is moving forward and working really well and is closer to winning, and then the person who's almost having to play catch up and get back into the game.
Wow, that sounds like you really don't like control, Sammy.
I really hate control, as everybody knows. Although, again, we're not talking about control as in like deboning and stuff like that. We're talking about control as in playing catch up.
Yeah, stopping your opponent's plan.
Yes.
And the cool thing about these roles that you take on is that they can change within a game. Almost always, especially if there is a control deck out there, there's going to be a point where that control deck has to decide, okay, I am going to win the game from this spot faster than my opponent because they've been controlling the board so expertly or whatever. So almost always, if there's a slower deck, they're going to have swapped the tables on the beatdown and assumed that role. But in a lot of matchups, that's often towards the very end of the game, where once they've swapped, the opposing former beatdown deck has almost no way to win.
I think that's a really important thing to highlight, is that these roles do change back and forth, and you're always going, it's like this constant push and pull between the two decks. I'm ahead, I'm behind, I'm ahead, I'm behind. And that's very natural. And while it's always great to always be the one ahead, you should not expect to always be the one that's ahead of the other person. That's always the goal, but that's not what's always going to happen.
Right. So that's in our deck building video. That's why we put in that you'd always need some sort of spot in your deck for some amount of interaction pieces where you have something available to you and go, oh, I am the control now. I need to slow down my opponent or do something that will put me back ahead.
Or just that removal pieces are oftentimes more efficient.
Yeah,
at least like one or two.
Yeah, I think this is for our listeners for the Harry Potter TCG. It was very, very obvious that this back and forth was a thing in the starter decks where you have those charms cards, and most of the decks are creature based where you can have the creatures removed and back and forth there. You know that if you spend a few actions early on removing your opponent's creatures and then suddenly you've got more of them, you're going to win because you have that inevitability, whereas your opponent doesn't. They've run out of that resource.
Yeah, those original starter decks from the original game, I think, are a really great example of what we're talking about. Getting slightly ahead by playing more creatures and then trying to remove those creatures and create an obstacle of some sort and playing your own and then getting ahead. And then your opponent does what you just did back to you. And the original game really did rely heavily on a bunch of creatures that did just that, and then cards that helped to do that in terms of spells. And I think the game has become more complex since then, and the person who's ahead around the beatdown and then the control person isn't as obvious anymore because there's more types of decks, there's more strategies, and the game just has a more complex base now.
Which is a great way to segue into the idea of how are you trying to figure out that you're the beatdown or you're the control in these matchups where it's not quite as clear cut, say like an aggro deck versus an aggro deck, or like combos kind of in this wibbly wobbly area that you're not exactly sure where they're going at any point in the game.
Wibbly wobbly area. That is
Yeah.
a quote we shall use from now on. I love
Official
it.
terminology, even.
Yes.
Yeah, but usually I like to look at it as the easiest way to recognize that you are the control is when your opponent is going to kill you on the next turn. Like they have lethal on next turn, and you're like, wow, I am
Yeah,
definitely in the control situation. I definitely
very
need to
little
do
option.
something. Yeah, but that's also not very helpful in a lot of games because when you're one step away from losing, you usually lose the game, surprisingly enough.
Yeah, I think that's pretty evident in Harry Potter is that inevitability is undoable a lot of the time. Is if you are a turn away from winning, you're very likely to just lose because there's not a easy way to recover when you're so close in Harry Potter. You do need to recognize it quite a few turns out.
Yeah, and I think some good examples just to kind of give you guys some solid examples of kind of what we're talking about. If you know your opponent is playing creatures and you only have 10 cards left in your deck and they have 10 plus power on board, that's that point. If you're playing VTJ and they have 9 potion power or 12 if they're going to do a 3 turns combo, that's the point where you're like, I have 1 turn left to try to get out of this situation. So those are some examples of kind of what we're talking about when you need to recognize like, wow, I'm in that spot. I'm about to lose. Can I do something to get out of this?
Also, this goes back to like that wibbly wobbly area because VTJ might actually not be one turn away from lethal if they have
That's true, yeah.
9 or 12 power. They might be like 5 or 6 turns away, and you have no idea.
And I think that talks about how important it is to know what the decks are that you're playing against. With a VTJ deck, for example, even if they do have 12 power, they need access to that 1 card, which is restricted to 1. So think to yourself, what's the probability that they have access to it? Is it in their discard? Have they been drawing a lot this game? Is it still in their deck? And you need to be able to understand where that deck is and how close they are to actually acquiring that win con. If it's a creature deck, for example, they might have Steel Claw. Do they have 3 Steel Claws in their discard pile? And then what's the chance that they have 1 in their hand still? Or do I have more time because they're just not at that point yet?
Yeah, it's very important to recognize from the onset what is your plan and what is your opponent's plan and who is in what stage of fulfilling that plan. That will give you that definition of who is the beatdown. They're further ahead, I need to control. I'm further ahead, stick to it and push it through.
Yeah, I was actually playing a game of Commander last night, and somebody was playing against. I know, and somebody was playing very powerful cards, and he made a quote, and he was like, "Do you think that your deck is not as strong as mine just because I'm playing these cards?" He's like, "Your deck often competes with mine," and my response was, "Yeah, you're playing cards that cost 4 times what mine do because yours are just 4 times as better, but I understand at what point your deck is close to winning and what those combo pieces are, and that at that point I need to disrupt it." And I think that that's when you're playing any game is what helps to determine a player who's just kind of average and a player who's a little stronger at playing the game because they're able to recognize when their opponent is really close to winning. And this is a really great skill that you can develop to just be a better player. And then even if your deck maybe is at a slight disadvantage, if you're a better player because you can recognize these things, you can often overcome them.
And likewise, I think that if you're able to recognize when your deck is trying to play each role, even when it's like a role that your deck isn't normally good at supporting, it will greatly increase your chances of winning. Because I think that if you're trying to play a role your deck doesn't support well, you're probably going to lose because you're in an awkward situation. But if you're playing the role that you're not, like if you're trying to play Beatdown when you're actually the control because, well, that's what your deck is geared to do, you're definitely going to lose.
Yeah, so I think that's a good segue there into examining how each archetype in a game, i.e. aggro, combo, control, sort of fits these roles of beatdown and control and when it applies to them. How they best play each role when it comes to being beatdown or control. So aggressive strategies, obviously, the vast majority of the time will be the beatdown because they just want to play their plan out very quickly. They have a high density of cards in their deck that don't necessarily have to do a certain thing, but do the same thing very well and very early. Great examples of this one obviously is the creatures deck, but also spellslinger decks. You'll just have a deck entirely filled out with low cost creatures that are good damage per turn for their rate, or same with spells that might have a little extra tempo thing tacked on. But being the beatdown, they want to play everything on curve. They want to keep the tempo. They want to make sure that they can get the job done really, really quickly. So most of the time they will be beat down, but obviously if you are in, say, a mirror match, creature versus creature, there will be the occasion where you're even something as simple as being the second player. You might now be the control deck, even though that's not what aggro decks do.
Also, just because you're recognizing that, yes, I am the beatdown in this situation, that doesn't mean that you can't play disruption cards. And oftentimes it is even just better to play disruption cards because, as we're probably going to talk about a little bit later, almost every disruption card is going to cost your opponent more actions than it took you to play that card, which is why even aggressive strategies are going to run some form of removal most of the time.
Yeah, if you are playing out the aggressive role, you might see it as more beneficial to play a disruption piece at some point. You recognize my opponent is trying to now control me, and I can make that too difficult of a thing to do by disrupting them back first. So it will cost them too much now to disrupt me, and I can play out the rest of my plan afterwards.
Yeah, and I think there's different kinds of disruption that you can play depending on where you're at in the game. So if we're this aggressive strategy and we're playing a bunch of creatures, if we're ahead and we're on the beatdown, maybe we're doing stuff such as in the stands or through the arch to stop my opponent from stopping me doing my thing because I'm ahead. Whereas maybe if we're on the tail end of stuff and we're on that control side, we're trying to play catch up, and maybe at that point we're playing something like stairs into slides or picking on Neville or something to get rid of my opponent's stuff that's putting them so far ahead so I can catch up. Or maybe the control is doing something else to just kind of slowly break away what they're doing so we have the time to take over that beatdown slot.
Which are four excellent examples of very strong tempo cards and very strong removal that are seen very often in high-level competitive decks. Which aggressive strategies might run a couple of these cards, but combo and control strategies are going to run a lot of these cards. Combo might run a little bit more than aggressive strategies because you do need to prolong the game and not die before you find your combo. They have to have enough game into aggressive strategies to not just completely fold over and die. Combo also needs to run things like cards that can either filter or churn through their deck fast enough to find their combo pieces. Think like tutor cards or just flat out card draw. And their cards are pretty expensive, so they do need some form of ramp. The Goblet of Fire 5-cost books are a great source of ramp if you're looking for any of those. They also want to make their combo as small as possible. It's much, much easier to find a 2-card combo than a 3-card combo or 4-card combo. So as much as they can pare down the essential cards, like the better.
Yeah, it makes them more resilient, right? So they're not having to take more than one turn to finish the combo off, for example. They also have less pieces to find, so the game plan is easier and quicker to execute. Combos is the hard one to really pin down. I think it's very, very intuitive for people that, oh, a low-cost creature deck is aggro, or a very, very large spell or item deck is a control deck, something that really goes after destroying all my creatures or removing items or something like that. The combo one is harder to tell because a lot of it is I'm the beatdown, i.e., I'm the person who wants to just play out what they're doing because I'll win first. If I have the correct cards in my hand, if I have enough lesson power in play to finish off what I need to do. A lot of the time for those combo decks, they don't have those pieces right there in their hand. And it's sort of a judgment call of, okay, I am close enough that I am the beatdown. I just need to keep doing what I'm doing now, that I will get there quick enough. Whereas they might go, okay, I've only got one of my combo pieces in my hand. I really need to, at the moment, delay the game and stop my opponent from killing me before I can accumulate a few more of those pieces.
I think we're talking about two different kinds of like player types as well, because I really hate playing combo. I just enjoy I just enjoy when I can play a bunch of like little things and I can just make stuff work, whether it's good or not. Whereas combo often feels like it's on the back end and it's waiting for that one big burst of a turn to do something. And I think a lot of people get into the aggressive deck types first because it feels like you're always on the beatdown because you usually are, and it's a better feel good place to start playing the game and to learn the game. And then I think people just develop as players and they find different things that they really enjoy, and the aggressive stuff maybe takes a little bit more of a back seat and people kind of shift away from creatures as much and they start going into some other directions. So your actual play style is probably going to change depending on how long you've been playing the game and what you enjoy doing. But this whole beatdown and control kind of dichotomy is always going to be there.
I definitely agree. It can be a player dependent thing.
Yeah, and like some people, like Sammy, never decide that combo or control is the right place for them.
Nope.
Because it's very hard to see progress sometimes with these types of decks.
It's a big thing about those aggressive style decks, the ones that want to be the beatdown from the get-go, is they have that high density of cards in their decks that are just standalone going to progress their game plan. You don't need to wait for another card to come along. It's a lot more easy and intuitive to make that progression, and yeah, therefore more satisfying. It's what people gravitate towards too, right?
Which is a good segue into our third archetype, which is control, which almost always is playing control until the very last stages of the game where they switch to a beatdown, they play like 2 cards, and then the opponent has no way to catch up.
And they normally achieve that beatdown status by removing their opponent's resources until they just don't have anything left. So they're now the beatdown because they're the only player with a way to actually progress the game state.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to play the game when your opponent can't do anything. If you think about like pre-banning of invisible ink and like those lesson destruction decks that like you stare at them and you have 0 lessons in hand and 0 lessons in play and 20 cards in hand, and you're like,
At that point, the invisible ink decks have sort of become both the beatdown and the control because the other player is just nothing.
Yep.
Yeah.
We saw a good example with this too, with a recent deck, I believe from the November tournament. That was the deboning Hogwarts History lock deck. And that was very much so on the back foot for most of its games until it could get out Hogwarts History, get the deboning. And then at that point, it played Madame Maxime and it literally just kind of looped, stopping your opponent from playing. And then it became more of the beatdown and the opponent was playing some catch up.
Well, it became more of the everything.
Well, yeah, true. It was literally everything. What a deck.
Yeah. To dive a little bit more into control, they usually have a large selection of removal and tempo pieces to disrupt their opponent effectively. They're usually looking for cards that give high action economy.
Which is the important point for Harry Potter, right? Yeah. Like a lot of other card games will be very much card advantage based. Whereas Harry Potter, we have the ability to use an action to draw a card. So card advantage isn't the worst thing in the world. It's important, but for us, it's very much that action economy, right? If you can use an action to take away 2 of your opponent's actions, that's really beneficial.
And because action economy is card economy in this game, where you can trade an action for a card, but you can't go backwards, which means that actions are much more valuable than cards. And the card draw that exists in this game only exists to make your card drawing more action efficient. These control decks also almost always will be trying to get up to a higher power level, or level of lessened power, because higher cost cards are just more action efficient than lower cost cards.
Yeah, when it comes to like actually finishing the game or being good at control, like you'll see most of the mass removal stuff, if it's very, very strict or very, very strong removal, it will need to cost a lot, right? Because you can't just have a 1 cost spell that says remove all creatures or something like that.
Hey, we have a 1 cost card that says discard all wands in play. That's some good mass removal.
And look, that was just a mistake. We should have never printed it. It's on the next ban list.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful card. Wonderful art.
So now that we've talked about these 3 different types of strategies, and we've talked a little bit about what are they trying to do and how your deck fits into them, you also need to be able to recognize what is your opponent doing and how are they trying to accomplish their game plan. because Harry Potter, every competitive two-player TCG is not just about you doing your own thing. If it was, we'd all be playing solitaire. There are these three overarching strategies, but also a lot of intersections between them, some overlap. Decks can be doing multiple parts of these, taking and choosing from all of these kinds of strategies into some wibbly wobbly mess. But it's your job in the game to determine, well, before the game, you should determine what your deck is doing. But during the game, you should be watching your opponent, seeing what cards they're playing, and trying to determine what are they doing and how can you counteract what they're trying to do.
Yeah, because when we look at it, beatdown versus control and determining who's on the beatdown, it's a two-part equation, right? It's knowing what you're doing and then figuring out what your opponent's doing and putting those together. So a big part of it would be recognizing, okay, if I'm not doing my game plan, I need to interrupt what my opponent's doing. So how do you do that for each type?
So for aggressive strategies, there's usually three main points that you're trying to be doing against them. First one is you're trying to make their plays inefficient when they play like a creature. If you can kill it the moment it hits the board, maybe their black bat is only hitting for 2 damage instead of hitting for 20 damage when it stays on the board for 9 turns. And it's now a much worse card.
Or their, baby dragon is suddenly, that's done nothing but cost them a lesson. If you're trying to slow down the aggressive deck, that's exactly what you're after, right?
Yeah, you can let them build up their board state and then hit them with mass removal. And by doing that, get a better rate for your removal, which is what a lot of control or combo decks are going to do. They're going to play like Drawing the Sword, House Elf Exploration, Transfiguration Test, Table Trouble, try to wipe out 2, 3 more cards with just one. Or you can slow down their ability to develop the board or progress the game state. Oftentimes these are cards with taxing or restrictions, Azkaban in the Stands, Wanted Poster through the Arch. These cards that will stop them from trying to play what they want to play.
And I think mentioning those cards is super important because those are not the exciting cards to play. Like, those are the boring cards to play. The exciting cards are the ones that are like doing damage to your opponent or making them discard cards from their hand. But what you're talking about, all those like tempo pieces or whatever, they're necessary. And I think a lot of players don't think about how necessary those cards are because they're not exciting. And it's a huge mind shift to have to think like, even if a card isn't super exciting, it's still needed in my deck for various reasons. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about are those reasons.
Wow.
Sammy, I don't know about you. Azkaban, I think that's very exciting to play.
I think it's very boring to play. I think it's a very good card.
I suppose, that's again, it's a player's preference right there, I think, because Azkaban, I love that sort of feedback on like, did I choose the right option? Did I choose spells correctly when they're playing creatures, because that was the thing that was going to put them over the line or something? I think that could still be fun.
I think Azkaban is like super interesting because, or it's not interesting when like you're playing against creatures and you have no creatures and you're like, I played Azkaban, I named creatures, okay. That's boring. But like when you're playing in a deck where you have to name something that your deck also wants to be doing, right?
Yeah.
That card is super exciting. I don't know about you, Sammy.
So I think there's a big difference between exciting, boring, and then interesting. Those are very different adjectives. And I think that the card is still interesting when you have to make those choices, but I don't think that necessarily makes it exciting.
I think
in my mind, those are very, very different definitions of cards.
Look, I agree with you, Sammy. I think they're very different definitions. I think it's all three of them, though.
Yeah. Anyways, moving on from Azkaban. This is a fascinating conversation, but on to combo. Ways to disrupt them. Combo decks almost always need high lesson power, so hitting their ramp pieces, their books, their wands, their whatever, great way to slow them down. Their banned wand shop, great way to slow them down.
Exactly why we banned it, right? Because it made combo like that much quicker.
Hashtag unban wand shop.
Bunking. He talks about Azkaban being unexciting and then he's like one shot. Yeah, okay. Anyway, there's things like you can stop them from being able to play their combo cards. Usually these fall into 3 different categories: hand disruption, draw control, and discard pile, recursion effect, stopping. You can remove their key pieces on the board after they've been played. A lot of combo decks need at least a couple cards on the board before they can go off and win the game. So things like Hogsmeade Station, or like if your opponent is trying to do some weird brass scales or Hogwarts a history loop, being able to remove those. And the last one is putting pressure on them, which is an excellent tool that aggro has or aggressive strategies have in order to slow down both combo and control decks.
Right. So if you make it appear as though like they need to deal with you before they start doing their combo, then that sort of slows down their combo inherently, right? There's also like you can tax them as well, right? We've talked
Yeah.
about Azkaban being the example, but with Walpo or anything that makes, for example, playing a few cards cost more actions, you can turn something that should fit into one turn have to go over multiple turns so that you slow them down or making them having to deal with your piece that's slowing them down.
Yeah, and so we're talking about with combo, like recognizing what is the thing that they need and then disrupting that. So whether it's like what you just said, Riss, do they need two actions in one turn to play VTJ into 3 turns? Well, then Azkaban is the counter to that because then they can't do those two things in one turn. It now costs 2 turns, that kind of thing. Or is it going to be they need to play a bunch of power to get to 15 to play smack? All right, well, when I see them getting above
What a
10
real
power, I know when they're above like 10 power, that's when I'm going to start getting rid of like their mana rocks or whatever else. So it's again going back to what this conversation started with a couple of minutes ago with recognizing what is my opponent doing and then what is like that tipping point where there's a point I can't come back from. And this is a way to make yourself a better player again, recognizing your opponent as much as your own stuff.
And a better deck builder, I think
Yes.
if you recognize what you're up against and what your deck's trying to do, fill those slots in your deck that are the interaction pieces with the best fitting tools. So
Yes.
if you are an aggro deck, maybe the best fitting tools is spot removal and something that stops your pieces being interacted with. So bad example might be the invisibility potion or something like that, or stairs to slides and picking on Neville, cards that are within your power cost range that can sort of interact with your opponent. If you're in combo, maybe you need to slow your opponent down pretty significantly. So it would be falling into the more control area as well with things like table trouble or the into the stands against like a creatures deck or a through the arch against a spellslinger deck.
And I think what
Uh,
you're talking about is a lot of like, obviously, you can't put all of this stuff into your main deck, right? Because your main deck needs to do your own thing and you only
yeah,
have a limited number of slots. So, this is where your sideboard becomes really important to really build that effectively so that even game one, if you're not able to keep up, in game two, you can sideboard properly and you will have hopefully the answers at that point to take care of whatever you have to take care of. And maybe it'd be a good future episode for us to talk about how to build a sideboard. I know I'm awful at doing that. What like these are all the things to kind of include in your sideboard and to think about when you're building it. How am I going to stop these other strategies? What am I going to be able to sideboard into my deck? And then what am I going to sideboard out of my deck? And that's a much larger conversation, but everything Riss is talking about, really great to consider for your sideboard.
yeah,
But
absolutely. I think it's about recognizing that critical mass of what pieces are what, like how much do you need to have towards your game plan, the thing that you most often want to do, and what the critical mass is for the interruption or the interaction pieces in your deck as well. The very last tournament, I had a game where I quite more often than not was not signing anything in because they didn't quite fit as far as what would actually be interactive against my opponent. But I had one game where I sided all 15 cards in. Yeah, so it's really about recognizing what will actually slow my opponent down and when I need to do it.
that sounds so wrong. Citing in
Doesn't it
15
just?
cards.
But it's something I did my best at, judging that
Yeah.
I absolutely was on the control side. I absolutely need to make sure at all times I
Yeah.
had an option available to disrupt my opponent's plan, and it still didn't work.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, like sometimes deck matchups are just not in your favor, and
Yeah.
that's going to be a
Yeah,
constant in any competitive two-player TCG.
yeah, I mean, decks are shuffled. There is randomization and variance in it, but it's also good to recognize that you might not have been wrong. Like, you shouldn't be outcome orientated with how the games play out. You might have
Yeah.
correctly judged that you were in the control space, and just wasn't available to you.
And like sometimes a matchup is 80-20 and you can't hit the 20.
I mean, that's a great thing for us as the design team to take away, is that we should be trying to design for giving people those tools of dealing with these different spaces that they need to work in, and removing those 80-20 matchups as best as possible.
I think they're always going to exist in some form. Yeah.
Maybe 70-30 is what we aim for then.
Yeah. 70-30. Much better odds. That 20 got 50% better.
There you go.
That way. We just increased your chances of winning by 50%. What good designers we are.
But so we talked about how to like combat aggro and combo. So let's talk about how to combat control.
Yeah, so I think control is a hard one, because I think most of the time the best way to combat control, if it is the control in the beatdown versus control, is just do your game plan, right? So you just do your game plan. So you are thinking to yourself, well, there's not really much to think about here. I just do what I do, and I'll get there. But the way to combat control is to make the controlling difficult. A few things you could consider are stuff like sticky cards, things that if they're removed, well, so what? It's not really that big of a loss, because it either replaced itself or it had good action economy, card economy on that card. It didn't really cost you much, but it did cost the control. You can have threats with benefits. A good example of this is anything that comes into play with a benefit. So if you're the aggro deck, a good one would obviously be Black Bats, very, very popular. Welsh Green Dragon for the creatures, particularly Porcupine, something that, draws you a card and does something. Another way to combat the control is to make their efficient answers inefficient. So have diverse angles of attack. Maybe you're not playing out all your creatures that can just be wiped out in one go. Play around drawing the sword. Maybe you don't play out your 3 X1 creatures so that they can be pop, pop, pop. Maybe you play out the less efficient 2/4 creatures or something like that, so that it's hard for their removal to get a good rate. The different angles of attack, maybe you're playing spells out. You play your Steel Claws instead of playing out that extra creature, just so that you can get the benefit out of it now. It makes their answering the creatures later on less efficient, because you've already got the benefit out of that card in your hand. Another good one is to just put on the pressure. If you're putting on the pressure, there's an added benefit in Harry Potter TCG, which is you more likely to dump their healing cards into the discard pile, which can be very, very useful because it stops them recovering and being in that control spot. The other thing the pressure can do is really change the perception of the game, where it feels like there is a time pressure. They have to start trying to win soon, and they might make bad decisions because of that.
I think that a lot of these talked about things are actually very deck building oriented. When you're playing aggro versus control, I think the game plan doesn't start in the game itself. It starts in the deck selection choices. Like, okay, am I going to be playing Prickly Porcupine over like Vicious Wolf or something, or Cunning Fox, something that gives me a little bit more damage per turn, but isn't actually going to be helping me as much in this matchup?
Yeah, so you're making that evaluation in the deck building stage, right? Like, is the extra damage more important, or is the stickiness, the card recovery, or making the control player's job more difficult the better thing to do in the deck building stage?
And like diversifying angles of attack. If you jammed your deck with 40 creatures and 20 lessons, well, good luck diversifying your angles of attack.
Yeah, like you're making yourself just super susceptible to just any form of board removal.
One thing that we talked about with 2 or 3 of the archetypes that we just talked about and how to combat them was putting on pressure. And one thing that we haven't really mentioned is that there is like a mental game that is played during card games, and putting on the pressure also just kind of plays a little bit with your opponent's focus on the game and their like ability to just calmly handle the situation. And the pressure that you put on can often make them just make a mistake because they're feeling that pressure, and it's that mental component. Obviously, you're not trying to like ruin your opponent, but putting that pressure, raising their anxiety a little bit in terms of like, oh my God, what one do I take care of? Do I get rid of that thing or that thing? Do I play lesson? Do I play that? That extra component can also also help a control or combo player just slip up a little bit. And maybe that will help your deck get ahead enough where you're now on the beatdown and you're now in that position to win.
And because this is all like it is a perception thing, like trying to figure out who's the beatdown, who's the control. That's something that you need to be making in the spur of the moment. And the more pressure you put on your opponent, the less able they are usually to like adequately determine when do they need to be flipping the switch.
Yeah, it could definitely. I think the biggest thing with the pressure aggro decks can have is that it makes your opponent flip that switch too late. So they go, oh, no, I still need to be controlling. The amount of times I'll see something like my opponent's turn is playing a Madame Pomfrey and healing just for me to do that damage all back on my next turn really shows that like that pressure can make people panic into making a decision where they feel like I need to recover quickly. I need to make sure that I have more than enough cards left in my deck or something like that. So yeah, there's a big mental aspect to it.
And especially like way back in the beginning where I talked about your opponent is threatening lethal, almost always it's not as clear cut as I have 10 power of creatures on board. You have less than 10 cards in your deck and you're going to die on my next turn in the creature damage phase. It's going to be like, oh, he's threatening a Steel Claw for lethal, but does he actually have it in his hand? And the pressure that you've put on your opponent might make them think, okay, I need to play around the Steel Claw, when they actually don't have that leeway and need to recognize, oh, if I play around the Steel Claw, I'll lose anyways. So I need to take the only option I have, which is to try to take my game plan.
Yeah, and that's a big part of the pressure, right? People might not realize that.
Pressure is like one of the biggest tools that aggro has to combat combo and control. And it's bigger than you are.
Yeah,
it's like
seeming bigger than you are, puffing your chest up and going, yeah, I'm throwing all my creatures down on board because I know I'm going to get through. And your opponent going, well, okay then.
I need to do damage control when sometimes they don't.
Sometimes they just need to keep developing because the damage now is not as bad as what it would be later.
So yeah, we talked about a lot of different things here, and we talked about a lot of this to hopefully give everybody a better idea of kind of how to build your deck or what to think about as you're building your deck, how to make you a better player overall, and then just kind of the steps to think about in terms of where is your deck in the game? Is your deck the beatdown? Is your deck the control deck? Where are you at which point, and how does that role shift? I'm going to throw it over to Riz to talk about kind of the steps to think about in terms of the archetypes for your deck.
So I think it's important to think about both the deck building phase and being actually in the game. Obviously, in the deck building phase, we've talked about how aggressive combo and control decks each play out, and then what the best steps are for combating them to switch yourself being on the control back to being the aggro. So aggro decks, they want to be playing efficient. They want to be playing early. They are susceptible to mass removal. Combo decks, they rely mainly on having the right cards at the right time. So hand control, slowing down their power progression in the game and removing those pieces from the board, generally the ways to interact with them. And control, just a bit of diversification of what you're doing. Don't leave yourself susceptible to being answered with a single card or one easy strategy. I think when you're in the game, you do need to quite often think about who is the beatdown now when the answer isn't so obvious. So you might have to think, am I the beatdown because I am fulfilling my plan exactly how I want to? Or is my opponent's plan just that much quicker than mine, where I need to be controlling? And then the next step is probably something we didn't talk about or lay out very clearly in the rest of the conversations we're having is, if I am the control, how do I get myself into the position of being the beatdown? What are the things I need to do to flip that switch back over? If I am playing against a aggressive creature deck, make their creatures really inefficient or wipe them off the board. If I'm against a combo deck who's only a couple cards away from finishing their combo, do I need to attack their mana because their mana is the weak point, or do I need to go after their card selection, stop them drawing cards, or not let them recur things from the graveyard by getting rid of their healing or their return effects like Hannah Abbott or Reparo? If you're against control, how do I stop them flipping the switch back on me and make sure I can get over that line? Am I saving my big bursty power damage for the very last turn, or is it better to use it right now where it will be quite effective and I've just made it so that I have a small gap to finish off at the end? I think the beatdown and who's on the beatdown is definitely something you need to think about through each step of the game, both at the beginning when you're establishing what is my strategy for the rest of this game, and then at any key point where it's not very clear who's what role, you need to be thinking about what tactics do I need to take to get myself from control and into that beatdown to finish the game.
And I think that oftentimes one of the ways to flip that is a very key piece of removal on like a piece that your opponent will take several turns to recoup from. Like if they're a combo deck and you just killed their Hogwarts of History, maybe it's going to take like 10 more draws for them to be able to get their Hogwarts of History back into play. And with that one action, you've maybe taken like 3 or 4 actions and you've now taken the lead in the tempo. Or you've played a very strong tempo card, like In the Stands, Through the Arch, Azkaban, and you've made their plays either impossible to play or just so much more inefficient that you've now taken the lead and you can start applying the pressure.
That was a really great wrap up of a lot of the stuff that we talked about. This is all super complicated and is constantly shifting as the game shifts, as we release new cards, as things are updated, as people discover a new strategy. So all of this is constantly shifting, and your deck and your playing will constantly shift because of it. So what we recommend is we have a new channel feature in our Discord where you can actually post your deck. It's called Deck Techs, and people can then comment specifically on your deck. And you can post questions there like, I have this deck, I'm not really sure how to get out of situations where I'm in the control situation and I want to become the beatdown. Or once I'm in the beatdown, I'm not sure how to maintain that long term because I seem to be going through cards in my hand a lot and then I don't have cards to play. What can I do? And people can help you kind of build your deck around that. And there's people in our Discord who have strengths in certain areas and will really be able to have a good conversation with you about how to build your deck further in these specific ways. So we highly recommend joining our Discord. The link is in the description along with all of our other social links. So make sure to go follow those so that you can join all of the things that we're doing, such as participating in the upcoming tournament we're going to have in about a month and a half. It will be our last tournament before we release a new set and a potential new ban list if we have updates this year. So those things are upcoming. You can get notifications for all of that on our website, our Discord, our Facebook, a whole bunch of different platforms. Thank you for listening. We really do encourage you to join our Discord to have a further conversation about this because it's really important. And until next time, we'll see you later.
Peace.
See yous.